Hi all, we'll be discussing today property leases for GP surgeries. As Tom said, questions are very much welcome. And yeah, let's get on with it. So the agenda today is to discuss what a lease is. So the different concepts of how a lease can be put together, what actually classes as a lease and what classes a contract, and so on and so forth. I think one of the big key considerations that we'll be discussing today is when a lease is required, because I think there's some confusion as to generally when you need a lease. And then we'll go through the approvals process and what leases can lead to for future-proofing your property. So just as a quick introduction to GP surveyors and also myself, GP surveyors is one of the primary leading surveyors in terms of primary care, and we've been going for 25 years. I've been with the company 8 years now and have worked in all the different services that we include, going from notional rent reviews right to sale and leasebacks. So we've got a good understanding of GP premises and what the future potentially looks like as well. This is some of the lovely faces you'll see here at GP Surveyors if you ever come to work with us. So the current ownership model of GP premises nationwide is currently split at this sort of level. So 55% are doctor owned, or what we would call owner-occupier properties. And about 45% of GPs nationwide are leased in some format. Now, what I would say about this is that this has drastically changed compared to how it used to look even 6 years ago. 6 years ago, you were looking at probably only 30% of properties being leasehold, and it was really unusual to be in a leasehold property. Now the ownership model's changing as the landscape of GP property, as is the landscape of GP partners. So as people struggle to come through the system wanting to buy into premises, the ownership model has adapted to allow for premises to be taken over as leasehold. So what is a lease? A lease is a document to regulate the occupation of the building. So it's a legal binding document. It tells you how to look after the document, who looks after what, and how we move forward. But for any document to be a lease, it has to include these 4 principles: the name and address of a property, the parties involved, so the owner and the occupant, the period in which that lease will be held for example, 10 years, 15 years, and the price. Price relates to the rent of the property. So you want to make sure that these 4 items are included within any lease. Otherwise, it doesn't hold much step to go forward. I would say if you have a lease currently, you want to make sure that these 4 items are up to date and fresh and are in what I would call your property pack, which is something that I always talk about with my clients, which is it just holds all the details of your property. So if you are leasehold, you have a lease there and the names of the tenant and the landlord are up to date. Any rent memos that we'll discuss in a bit as well are within that folder as well. We'll just take a quick poll just to see how many of you do have leases in your property, just so that if we need to tailor the webinar a bit further, we can do.
Okay, the poll will just pop up on your screen shortly. If you could just pop an answer in there and submit it, and that should just take a minute or so for everyone to do it. Okay, just a couple more people if that's Okay. Okay, so most people have responded now. So it's quite an even split really from people that are here today. And we've got 45% of people saying yes, they've got a lease, 27% no, and 27% aren't sure.
Okay, no problem. So I think the big thing to take away from that is some of you will know and understand leases a bit better or have a good idea of what a lease will hold, and some it'll be brand fresh new to you, brand new information. So a lease is required when there are uncommon parties, and I think this is the easiest way uh, of understanding when a lease is required within general practice. Because if you have a partner leaving who is also an owner, and he's no longer going to be working the premises, but he will continue to own the property, then yes, you require a lease. So any uncommon parties. So whenever you have an owner that no longer is within the premises, but will carry on holding ownership of the property, you need to get a lease put in place. Where it says when a term is over 3 years. So if you're going to remain within the property over a 3-year term, then that is when we would say it requires a lease rather than a contract or a license. So if you're not going to hold premises there for 3 years, for example, if you're waiting for a new building, if you're waiting for another space to open up, and you think that will be under that 3-year time slot, then you will require a contract or a license. And the reason why we discuss that is because it doesn't attract the same level of stamp duty land tax that a lease does. So any leases over 7 years they have to be registered with land registry, and that does attract stamp duty. So if you're not planning to be within premises for longer than 3 years, we would discuss having a license put in place rather than going down the lease route. However, if you are unsure of that, then that is definitely something we need to discuss, because both of a license and a lease both cost money, and you don't want to be spending the same amount of money twice. And it's a case of going forward and what you plan in terms of your succession planning for the practice or as an owner. So it's definitely worth understanding your environment and what your succession looks like. If you have all owners within premises and they are looking at succession planning in terms of they might be retiring at different stages, but the knowledge that they're going to retire at different stages also comes up with the prospect of buying them out, you need to know if that's feasible for the practice to do so if nobody's going to buy in, and how that looks. And normally what that requires is a lease, to be able to make sure that the occupation of the property is safe, to make sure that you as tenants aren't looking after anything over and above what you should be looking after. And equally that the landlord looks after the property as well in terms of repairs and insuring it. So types of leases. There are many different variations of leases. The main ones we talk about in general practice are tenants internal repairing leases and full repairing and insuring leases. But like I say, there are others, but these are the two mainstream ones. Now, tenants internal repairing, it is what it says on the tin, as you were. It's the practice, the tenants, looking after the internal skin of the property, and that is their rights and obligation to do so. So normally what we say is, and again, there are variations of tenants' internal repairing. Normally what we say is anything from the plaster in, the practice look after, and anything from the structure out, the landlord looks after. But obviously there are many multiples of this, and the notably 2 questions I get asked is who looks after the windows, because technically they're in and out, and who looks after doors. But the other one is who looks after the boiler. That's always a question I get. So again, they can be structured in different ways. Sometimes what we say is the window glass is looked after by the tenant, and the actual framing, the structure of the window, is looked after by the landlord. In regards to the boiler, what we say is that, or what we can say is that the tenants look after the servicing obligations of the boiler, but any of the repairing obligations or the change of a boiler, that is down to the landlord. So there are different levels, and once you start getting into your lease, the nitty-gritty comes out, and you start really dwindling down into who looks after what. But as a generalized concept, for tenants internal repairing, the tenants look after the plasterboard in, and the landlord looks after the plasterboard out. And that's how, as in a very generalized way to discuss it, that's how we look at it. And what that means is if you have, for example, more than your fair share of wear and tear. So, for example, we've had this recently, one of my surgeries, is a patient went into the toilet and left the tap running and flooded the toilet. That would be a repair that the practice has to take on. If I mean, it only did some damage to some tiles, but they had to repair that. If, for example, the lift, if you have a lift in your surgery, the lift stopped working, the lift is part of the structure, that would be a landlord task. So there are different things to look and negotiate over. A full repair and insuring lease is a little bit different. So a full repair and insuring lease is where the landlord looks after nothing, and just receives the rent, and the tenants, the practice, look after pretty much everything. So structure, the outside grounds, and the insuring of the property. And to do this, they retain between 4 and 8% of the rent to do it, dependent on how old your property is and the current state of the property. Now, I would say on average, most properties fall into the 5% category of retention of rent. I think that's a lot of maintenance for not a lot of rent currently. But I think you would be the best advice I can give you is that you go and look at how many repairs you've done over the last year and how much that's cost you, or the last 3 years, get a good average of what it's cost you, and then you'll know whether actually it's feasible for you to maintain that property with retaining that as such a little a portion of the rent. If you're looking to do a lease, this is what I would do. Because many practices, everybody's different. Practices that I have a lot of worked with, they do have full repair and insuring leases, but that is because the practice manager's husband is a builder, or one of the nurses or one of the partners has really good connections and things like that, so they always have really good maintenance connections. I would say if you are just a practice that don't have that kind of connection and you would be just googling and getting 3 quotes, then sometimes it is better to be under a tenant's internal repairing lease, because everything's looked after by the internal skin by the landlord. You don't have to worry about the insuring obligations of the property, and you don't have to worry about external repairs. or the structure either. So I'll just pop up the next poll.
Okay. So this is just whether you know whether your lease contains a service charge or not. That should have popped up on your screens now. If it's not popped up, it'll be in the chat, so you can answer it there as well. Okay, so most people have answered that now. It's a split, but most people aren't sure. So 60% of people aren't sure. And I guess obviously you won't be sure if you've not got a lease either. So people that have got leases, 25% have said yes, there is, and 16% have said no, there isn't.
So as just a quick chat about service charge, before we move on to the next bit, but as service charge is again, it kind of explains itself. It's a charge that is put onto the practice for services implied, for example, cleaning, bin collection. You know, sometimes it involves, if you've got third parties within your premises and you're sharing a building, the electric and things like that. What I would say is it's completely different to rent. And years ago, we had problems with NHS Property Services renting properties out to GPs with a very low rent but a very high service charge. And the reason that was happening is because service charge isn't reimbursable, or normally isn't reimbursable to GPs through at the ICB. No, your reimbursement is your rent. So your notional rent, your actual rent, if you have a lease, that's the reimbursement. But normally you don't get your service charge reimbursed. So what was happening was you were having really low rent, and then the practice were having to find how to pay service charge, and the service charges were getting bigger and bigger. So yeah, it's definitely something I strive to, as much as possible, stay away from when I'm creating leases. Sometimes it's impossible to do. Sometimes you have to have a service charge within a property, especially if it's a shared property. Because you know you share lighting, you share heating, you might share cleaning services, you might share bin collections. So it is sometimes unavoidable. But what we try and do on that is potentially cap and collar it, where we can say that service charge will never go above something or never go below, whereas your rents will be reviewed normally. So, questions before signing a lease, and these are things that you should ask as a tenant. And what we tend to say, again, it depends on your situation, it depends on your environment, depends on what you're looking at. You could be looking at this as a succession planning, or you could be looking at it as a future-proofing the property with the NHS. So there are different standpoints. I think a landlord views signing a lease different than a tenant would look at signing a lease. So these tenant questions normally are towards the practice, because they're going to be the tenant. So how long will you stay in the building? What that means is, do you look around your property and go, it needs a lot of TLC, it needs a lot of love, you know, there's things like there's damp, there's we've still got carpet in some of our consultation rooms, we've still got sort of normal taps. We have leaks every year from our roof. You know, and if you're looking around your building and you're noticing these things, your boiler, it's hit and miss whether that works in the winter. These would be things I would be striving to get right now before going into a lease, because your building, once it's within a lease, it never has to be put back into a better state of repair than when you took over the lease. So what that means is that if you've always had a hole in your roof, well, as long as that hole in the roof doesn't get any worse, it never has to get repaired. You only ever have to bring that state of repair back up to the same level of when you signed that lease. So it's very important that you're looking around a property and you're going, right, are we happy? Are we happy to remain here with this state of repair? If not, then you need to make some adjustments. And that filters into this, is the building fit for purpose? There's a lot of times I walk around a GP property and the building's fit for purpose, but there might be an odd room that's not. You want to get that sorted. So, for example, I've been in surgeries where their cellars constantly flooded, but they keep patient notes down there on stilts, and you want to get that sorted, because otherwise that will be the same issue. You're not going to be able to get a landlord and sign a lease and go, we've got flooding in our cellar, and the landlord will go, you had flooding in your cellar yesterday, I don't need to repair that. So that's the thing. Also, if you sign a lease on any property and the CQC came round and went, your building is no longer fit for purpose, you still have to, under a lease, pay rent, even though you won't be receiving rent from the ICB because you won't be a practice, because they'll close you. You still, under a lease, you still have to pay rent. So you want to make sure that all the state of repair is in a good nick for a CQC visit, basically. Is the building part of the NHS future estate strategy? This is really easy to know, because when you've created your lease, it's all been negotiated and you're in your final document and nothing is changing. We'll send that to the ICB, or you should send that to the ICB. The ICB will then do what they call their value for money report on it, which means the district valuer will come out, look at the property, look at your lease, go, right, it's a 15-year lease, tenant's internal repair, 3 yearly rent reviews with 70,000 per annum as the rent. And he'll go around and he'll go, right, the rent's in line with the building. We're happy with the 3 yearly rent reviews. We're happy that it's internal repair. And then they might look at that 15 years and go, are we happy? Do we think this practice will be in this building for another 15 years? Is there a need for this practice to be in this building for another 15 years? And they'll say yes or no. So you'll know whether the building is part of the NHS future estate strategy. Equally, if you've got a really good working relationship with your ICB, bring them and just say you're looking at doing this, and have an honest conversation with them. They might say, oh, we're looking at a new development, we would like to go there. You don't know what's part of their future estate strategy unless you ask, but it is a good way to make sure your property and the practice are safe within the property. They're not going to get disbanded or moved because the NHS are agreeing that that building is fit for purpose for another 15 years. You want to know who your landlord is. Landlords can vary from old ex-GPs, old partners, to banks and councils, to companies, to trusts. So there are a massive variety of landlords. We GP surveyors as a company have roughly 370 investors who look to invest in primary care estates. So, and they range from single-handed investors who have nothing to do with the NHS, they like it's the secure income, to ex-GPs, to banks, to trusts, to, I think we all know, Assura, so yeah, who is your landlord? And what kind of landlord are they? Do you know if they have any other properties in the area? And then the last one is who will sign your lease. This is a very important one. And why this is important is because people have to sign leases. I think that's the thing, you have, not companies. So two to four people within your practice will have to sign this lease personally. And that is a big responsibility. And the reason that's a big responsibility is because if, for example, the NHS go, we're not going to pay you rent because your building has gone into such bad state of repair, those people on that lease are still liable to pay rent to the landlord. They're the people that the landlord's going to come a knock into. So it's really important that those four people or two people are understanding of the lease and understanding of their obligations and requirements under the lease. Now, you normally have your partnership agreement sit alongside the lease to say that any partner in the property has the same rights and obligations under the lease. But obviously, that's a side document and it's not a document that your landlord is privy to. So I would definitely say, you want to have as much information as possible. Any lease requires 2 signatories. So you can have a minimum of 2 signatories and a maximum of 4. And normally how it works is it's a bit of a revolving door. When those people retire, 2 new people come in and sign the lease, and it can just be, reassigned. Not a problem. So if people retire, you find 2 people take over their position, they sign the lease, and so forth and so forth. So it can be reassigned numerous times within the time frame of the lease, but it's definitely something that I say is people who sign a lease must understand the rights and obligations under that lease for moving forward. Benefits for a tenant. So I think with anything, a lease is really good at putting in black and white what your rights and responsibilities are for the property. It's really good then at avoiding any kind of dispute. So who's looking after what? There's no dispute. It's there in black and white who has to look after it. Because what happens is if you don't have a lease and you have a requirement for a lease, for example, and this is the example that comes up time and time again, your ex-GP has left premises, he's retired, and you're still paying him rent without any lease involved. It's what we would call a gentleman's agreement. You've known them for 20 years, perfect. It's always the case that relationships become strained when there's costly repairs involved. So, for example, when we've had really bad storms and the roof is now in repair and it's going to cost £5,000, £10,000, in some cases where they need a full new roof, in excess of that. Well, there's nothing written down to say it's anybody's responsibility. So whose responsibility is it? Is it the person who works there every day's responsibility to get the property fixed? Or is it the person who owns the property? And that's where a lease really comes into its own in explaining who should do what and how long you have to get those repairs done. Because if you don't have that, you can enter into a dispute and then solicitors are involved, a costly measure. Sometimes it goes to court, even more of a costly measure, or mediation. And it's a lot of money to be paying out just to find out who's responsible for a repair. It gives you a specified term. So it gives you the security that for 15 years, this property is going to be where this practice is from. And you have security in that and know that no changes need to be made to it unless you want them to. You can't be kicked out. It's a really good way of going forward. NHS rental reimbursement. As long as you've gone to the ICB and got your lease approved, your rent is guaranteed for that length of time. And the next one is really important. NHS improvement grants. So you will not be entitled to NHS improvement grants, or you shouldn't be entitled to NHS improvement grants if you don't have a lease in place and with the owners who have left premises. Or if you have an NHS improvement grant, if you have a lease in place and you're applying for an NHS improvement grant, you want a good length of lease because the NHS want to know that they can basically redeem services from the property that they're paying to improve. So it does give you a good amount of security putting your lease in place as a tenant. And it's the best way moving forward in terms of understanding your succession planning. You know, if you have no lease in place, and this is what a lot of people are learning now, if you've got no lease in place, but you should have a lease in place, GP partners are reluctant to come into practice as well because there is no security of that building. And also they don't know what their rights and obligations are as a GP partner coming into your practice. Most and all leases will give you a right to renew as long as it's under the Landlord and Tenants Act. So the majority of leases will give you the right to renew. So if you think our practice is, you know, really nice, we're quite new build, then what will happen is you can get to the end of your 15 years and you have the right to renew under the same lease, and basically you change the date, the names and the rent involved, but you have all the same terms. So that it's another way to sort of future-proof the property. Benefits for a landlord. Again, it's kind of the reverse. So, you know, they understand what they have to look after, they understand what they have to ensure. It avoids disputes, but it also protects the investment. So, and the value of the investment. That's a huge one because your value is wrapped up in the lease. It's not wrapped up in, you know, you saying, well, I receive this amount of rent every quarter. Well, that's great, but there's no guarantee you're going to receive that if you sell it. So the investment, it protects the investment, and it also tells us, or any surveyor, how we're going to value it, because we'll value it on the basis of how long's the lease, what's the rent in there, what's the repairing obligations, and how we move forward. So it gives you a clear understanding of what you're valuing. It also allows for the property to be transferable, so with that investment attached to it. So if you are looking to sell it, you can, and the lease transfers across with that sale, and the new owner has the same rights and obligations under the lease, and that again then protects the tenant because there's no worry. So these things are transferable, but it makes sure everybody's understanding of rights and obligations, and it clarifies what's happening within the building. NHS approval. This is the big area, I would say, that takes the most amount of time. Even negotiating a lease, this is what takes the most amount of time, is getting your NHS approval of your lease. And that is just because you're dealing with the NHS, you're dealing with ICBs and district valuers, and they have a lot on their plates. And unfortunately, we don't have enough district valuers. I think that's the best thing. And they have notional rents to review, as well as leases. So, you know, the backdated amount of work is quite high for them at the moment as well. NHS approval, what happens is you send your lease off and say, well, we're looking to sign this to secure our property. Does it reach your value for money criteria? And as long as there's fair and reasonable terms to all parties in there, then usually they come back and say, yes, it does. Unless, for example, they know that actually you're not going to be in that property, or the property isn't actually fit for purpose. And again, it just avoids property disputes. but it also secures your rent, which is the big thing. It's securing your rent to be paid for the length of time of that lease. So yeah, it's definitely one. If you're looking to put a lease in place, or you have a lease in place, you need to make sure that it's NHS approved. It's best practice. It secures the knowledge that you will always receive your rent. So yeah, it is the big one that you definitely need to make sure. You will normally get a letter back or an email back from the ICB saying, yes, this lease qualifies our value for money, or we approve it. So yeah, and that should again go in your property folder with your lease to say it's approved. So when you do go to get a valuation done, or you go to have new partners and new staff in, you can show this document, because quite a lot of them will ask for it. Investor friendly lease terms. So it's pretty much what we've talked about. Tenants internal repairing lease, or full repairing and insuring. That's what those two acronyms mean. Lease length. Lease length can vary. Normally, and what we say is what's market norm at this moment in time is 15 years. It's in line with what your hypothetical lease terms are for notional rent when a district valuer values the property. Rent review provisions, normally we say that is to be negotiated between a surveyor and the district valuer every 3 years. Armageddon clause. Now, an Armageddon clause, that really is what it says in the tin in my eyes, which is if the NHS ever turned around and went, we've gone into liquidation, we are no longer the NHS, we will no longer be, free for patients, it will be a privatised affair. The Armageddon clause allows you to break your lease because you will no longer be guaranteed rent from the NHS. So you can break your lease at that point and then look at your business model to change it to a privatised affair and renegotiate leases if that's what's needed. But it means you can all step away because you won't be being paid by the NHS anymore. Break clauses. Break clauses are a huge talking point and negotiation point. Investor friendly lease terms is that there's no break clause. They want you in the property as long as possible, risk free of a break. Now, with my head, that's what brings the most value as well. If you don't have a break clause in, as soon as you start adding break clauses within a lease, you start to reduce the value. So if you're looking to do a sale and leaseback, for example, there's two sides to that story. You want good lease terms for the practice, and you want to make sure they're fairly treated, but you also want to make sure that you've got a good length of lease so that you receive the right value in sale. So I would say you only put a break clause in is if you know that you're no longer going to be in that property after that time, or you are a two-handed GP practice and you are both looking to retire at a certain time point and you struggle to recruit. But just to be aware that you will take a knock on in terms of value. So sale and leaseback, it's one of our core services, especially in the current, environment of NHS and GP premises, is that we have seen an increase in sale and leaseback requests and discussions. And again, I would say we're one of the leaders in this service. We look to put a lease in place with the practice to then be able to sell it on the open market once that lease has been agreed. Now, a true sale and leaseback would be all the partners that are currently in premises own it, and they are wanting to basically sell their investment, their property, but still remain in premises and work. So that would be a true sale and leaseback. Equally, you can still do it if not all your owners are within property anymore, they might have retired, and you can't pay them out. So the sale of your building to an investor and the signing of a lease to allow to continue the use of the building for a fixed term is basically the description of a sale and leaseback. And I would say that we have quite a big uptake in that, of people doing that. Like I said, we're probably starting to come to sort of 50-50 of the country all being lease or owned. And so these kinds of requirements are on the uptake. The main time I see this is when you've got GPs wanting to retire, and the incoming GPs don't want to own the premises. They don't want the tie to the premises. They want to be in part of the business. They don't want the building to look after. So this is when sale and leaseback comes into its own. So we'll create your lease, get it approved by the ICB, then we'll take you to the market, and an investor will look to purchase you and be your landlord. So in summary, leases are required when there's an uncommon party. That means when one of your owners decides no longer to be working premises. Instructs specialists. So what that means is whoever you're looking to work on this lease with you, make sure you have a surveyor, a solicitor, all in primary care, and that you know from the get-go who's going to be the tenant and who the current landlords are. Because if you need a lease, that means there's going to be an uncommon party involved already, so you should already have a landlord. And always obtain NHS approval. That's the big one, because that's how you're going to guarantee your rent for that time of the lease as well, and to make sure you're part of any future estates for the NHS. So I think that's probably a good time to stop, and have any questions, feel free to ask away, and then we'll go from there.
So far that there haven't been any questions, so I can only put that down to you doing a fantastic job, Bex, and being completely clear and answering everyone's questions before they've asked. Someone's put their hand up, so I guess I'll just allow the microphone, because we've not got some time left.
Hi there.
Thank you, Heather. Sorry, my chat is not working. I can't enter anything in the chat. In the PIR leases,
Yes.
usually where will the electrics and the heating or the water pipe sit? Is that in structure?
So the actual pipe work.
Yes, if there is, let's say, I don't know, leak in a radiator, central heating pipe or something, and the electrics, where do that sit?
So if it's a leaking radiator, that normally sits with the tenant. If it's the actual pipe work within the walls, that sits within the structure.
Okay, and the electric cables running wherever in your attic and stuff, is that part of the structure? Usually?
Sorry, I missed that question.
The electric cables running in your attic, or the cables that you can't see,
Yeah.
is that part of the structure?
Usually yes, but if you've got a lease, it should determine that for you. What I would say is if you've got basically if the wiring is covered up, then yeah, it's part of the structure. If the wiring is loose, then it's kind of hit and miss who would look after that.
Thank you.
Okay.
I've got one more person with their hand up. Let's have a quick look. Jeanette, I've just unmuted you. You should be able to talk now.
Yeah, thank you. We've got one of those, the FIR lease, and we're currently undergoing a rent review, which we're still in dispute with at the moment with NHSA and the district valuer. So that's all going through. But my question really was, when you're coming up to a lease expiring, I think it was a 25-year lease. We're probably within the last 5 years of it now. Yeah. What's the process for that?
Are you wanting to stay where you are?
Well, I don't know. I'm hoping I won't be here next year, but I'll be retired. But it's just a question I was thinking about while we were going on.
Yeah, no,
what happens when renewal?
normally, I mean, it should stay in the lease, but normally 12 months before your expiry date on the lease, if you like, you're to get in touch with the landlord and start, or to have an internal discussion to say, are we staying here, or are we not? And if you are, get in touch with the landlord to say, we were looking at the right to renew the lease. Should we get on with discussing that? Because they do take a little bit of time, and you do want to get that back off to the ICB for approvals again. So 12 months before the expiry date.
Okay, thank you. That's great.
No worries.
Okay. I've just popped up a link in the chat in case you did want to get like a one-on-one consultation. If you've got any further questions or in-depth stuff that you don't want to ask on here, or you'd like to ask in private, there's a link there to book. We do have a couple more questions. So I've got a question from Michael Logan. So he owns the surgery, and there's been a fire that's damaged a nurse's room, and the insurers felt it was his responsibility to pay for the repairs rather than partnerships. What are your thoughts?
Have you got a lease in place? I think if there's no lease in place, it's very much half dozen of one. So it's that thing of you're going to run into maybe a costly dispute. I would say that if you are insuring the building, which is your right to do as the owner, then yeah, the repair could be your responsibility. Equally, depends how the fire started. There's lots of questions running through my mind, but it could fall on either party. I would say the sooner you can get that resolved, though, the sooner, because the NHS can stop the rent on that, because it's obviously not a usable room at the moment. So if you've not got a lease in place, that means your rent's going to fall. If you have got a lease in place, then that'll tell you who's got to look after what, and your solicitor can advise on that as well.
Okay, hopefully that's answered your question, Michael. They've got someone else with the hand up, Dr. DeBass. I'll just unmute you here. Give me a second. Okay, I think you're unmuted.
Yeah,
oh, there we go.
Yeah, can I just ask that if you sign a lease, let's say for a fixed term, 10 years, whatever, X number of years, and you're now out of that period for 4 or 5 years,
Yeah.
and you've never signed any lease, what is your position?
You have sitting tenants rights. So that's the position. You're classed as a sitting tenant.
So in terms of if there is the responsibilities, are they the same as you were in the lease, or is it pretty much?
Because you don't have a lease, it would be assumed that you would have the same rights and responsibilities as your previous lease, but you walk in a very fine line. And that's it. You can, it's up for a solicitor to debate that with you. I would suggest if you're out of lease but you've already had one, just enter back into it, and if you're happy with the old lease, just ask for a new one to be reissued.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we've got a few more minutes. Well, we've got another 10 minutes that we've got scheduled in. So has anyone else got any more questions? You can put it in chat or put your hands up and we'll take questions.
Yeah.
Right, if it's time, I'll probably, it wasn't a query, but over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, we have noticed that at the rent reviews, NHS is not increasing the rent. So like our rent is the same what it was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And we do invite sort of you guys, and you do the review and say, yeah, the rent is appropriate. I mean, why is that? Because how is that possible that the rent has stayed the same for over the last 10 years?
You could have been over rented from the start. Without knowing the facts and without looking at it, it could be the fact that you've been at the higher end of that rent for your area for that amount of time, and you just slowly become in line. It could be that, it could be lack of evidence in your area, it could be numerous things. But what I would say to you is if you've not had any changes to your property in 10 years, for example, if you've still got the same flooring as you did 10 years ago, or carpet or anything like that, and you can get higher specs, well, they're things that will increase your rent as well as, you know, increasing floor area, consultation rooms, things like that. But yeah, sometimes what happens is if you've had a good notional rent or a good rent, and you've been at the top end for your area, what slowly happens over time is you start to become way in line with everybody else. But yeah, it's not a case of inflation or anything like that it comes on the regular. Sometimes that's just how it is, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we've still got quite a few people here. Has anyone else got any other questions? Okay, I was just going to put one last poll up then if people are still here, just to get some feedback from yourselves about today's session. But we do have another question. Here we go. This is Michael from the previous chat question. I'll just unmute you. Okay, you should be able to talk now, Michael. You just have to unmute yourself at your end.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. How many years do you think is a good length of time as regards the landlord for having a lease made for before renewal? Is it 7 years, 10 years, 15 years? What type of time were you finding GPs are for a good lease?
Normally it's about 15 years. So normally what we say for a brand new fresh lease on a good standard of property, it's about 15 years you should be expecting for a lease.
Okay. I presume if you're going for sale and leaseback, the longer the lease, the more attractive it is to the purchaser of the surgery.
Yeah, so it definitely is. I think, you know, we used to have a sort of I guess a banding for properties that, you know, 15 years was kind of standard. Anything that was built at the 2022 mark, it would be 25 years, and anything in between the two was really good. Now 25 years has kind of dropped off the mark. It's really hard to get anything approved at 25 years unless it's a brand spanking fresh building. So the majority of things stick into that 15-year mark. What you don't want to happen is that tipping point of being at sort of 10 years or under, because that's where the value decreases, and it decreases your interest in the property in terms of an investor. Because like I say, 15 years is kind of standard, but it's also to do with mortgages. So what tends to happen is if somebody's buying you and they need a mortgage, they want the mortgage paying off at about year 12 and the last 3 years to be profit for them, is what we used to say anyway.
And as regards stamp duty, if a lease is made, it's up to the practice. Who pays for the stamp duty? Is that
the tenant?
Tenant.
Yeah.
Yeah, and is that a one-off payment, or is that done every time the lease is renewed?
I want to say it's a one-off payment, but that is an accountant's question. It could be every time it's renewed.
Well, that's fair enough. So therefore, it would be attractive for the tenants to have as long a lease as possible.
Definitely, I think it's attractive to both parties, for both of you to have security in the building as long as possible. Obviously, that very much depends on what's going on in the local area, what's going on in the practice, and they might have other ideas. But yeah, I think it's definitely desirable to make sure that your lease is as long, because it's more effective that way for everybody involved. If you're having a lease and you go, right, we'll have a lease for 5 years, and you're having to renew it every 5 years, there's different costs involved with that. For example, solicitors' fees, for example, surveyors' fees for checking out the rent. And then you're also having the time of having to keep going back to the ICB to get it approved. And also shorter leases at that sort of 5-year stage, they have a reflection in the rent. So your rent, I would expect to be increased. And if the ICB find that actually your property is in really good nick, you've got a stable practice, they will be saying, we're not going to approve a 5-year lease, we want you to have a 15-year lease, because we're not prepared to pay a heightened rent because you want the flexibility of a 5-year lease. So yeah, 15 years is kind of standard, and it's kind of desirable to all it's kind of fair to everybody involved, I guess is the best way to say.
Yeah. And can I just ask one question? Just, I know I'm asking a lot of questions here.
Yeah.
I reside in Northern Ireland, so it's slightly different than yourselves. But how are the as we call it, the board or the powers to be viewing the sale and leaseback of GP surgeries? Are they showing resistance to it, or are they embracing it?
I think it's health boards and ICBs alike have had to learn to embrace it. Let's put it that way. I think ideally, you know, and I am still a big advocate of this. It is still a very profitable business to be in, to own and occupy your property for GPs. I still think it's a good place to be, to have owner occupier GPs. But I think as we've come through the age of COVID, people wanting, you know, a different work-life balance, people wanting the flexibility of hours, you know, GPs wanting to be able to come in at 9 a.m. and finish at 6 p.m. GP partners have just changed their way of thinking. So ICBs and health boards have had to change their way of thinking. You know, not everybody wants to be a property owner, and that's fine. So they've had to embrace this, look, we're going to have leasehold buildings, and actually, you know, it's a good thing in the end, you know, because, you know, they've not got to discuss that with GPs exiting and worry about the properties not being able to carry on. You know, they're actually, they've got a good idea of how many properties they've got signed into leases, so that they can make their own succession plans going forward as well for the ICBs and health boards. So you will see some reluctance. There are areas that are reluctant, and there are areas that are really picky in terms of what they want to see in leases, or picky in terms of how that process goes. And every health board and every ICB work completely differently. And you're kind of at their whim for it, but they do approve the leases. And you know, some ICBs, and I have a few favourites, are really good at this process, because quite a lot of their buildings within their area are leasehold now, like I say. So yeah, so sometimes you do come up against a little bit of reluctance, but once you explain the procedure, or once you explain the need, they go. And no health board and no ICB can reasonably deny you a lease. It's just the terms that you're acting in.
Okay, thank you very much.
No worries.
Okay, well, that's 2:00 now. So unless anyone's got any last minute questions, we've just popped up the contact details here for you to take a note of. If you do want to get in contact with again with more questions, there's also the link I mentioned in the chat if you want to book an appointment to chat to Rebecca or one of our other colleagues regarding leases or anything else that we cover, such as rent reviews, national rent, market valuations. Those details are there, so we'll just leave them up. And yeah, there's no more questions. So as I said, you've obviously done a very thorough presentation, Rebecca. No one's got anything to ask. So yeah, thank you for all attending, and hopefully we'll hear from you soon, or see you soon on another webinar.